In the autumn of 1872, long after the last of the harvest had been brought in, and the air had turned sharp with the promise of a hard winter, a strange silence began to fall over the Veylor property. It was a silence not of peace, but of containment. It was the silence of a tomb being sealed from the inside. Adam Veylor, a man whose face had become as gaunt and weathered as the unpainted wood of his own home, was seen driving the first nail into the frame of his daughter's bedroom window. The sound of the hammer, a stark, a lonely punctuation in the otherwise quiet afternoon. The house, once a testament to a modest but complete life, was being methodically blinded. One window, one door, one opening at a time. If you find yourself compelled to understand the darkness that lies coiled within the heart of such stories, and this is your first time opening one of our case files, consider subscribing now to ensure you do not miss the final verdict. The year 1872 was, for the small, unremarkable township of Meadow Creek, a period of quiet recovery. The echoes of the Great War had faded, leaving behind a generation of men who were defined more by what they had lost than by what they had built. Adam Veylor was one such man. He had returned from the conflict with a quietness that the townsfolk mistook for peace, a stillness they assumed was the hard-won calm of a survivor. His wife, a woman remembered for the bright color of her shawls and the easy warmth of her smile, had passed from a fever some years prior, leaving him with their 2 young children. Then, in a cruel turn that seemed to curdle the very soul of the community, the children were taken as well, victims of a diphtheria outbreak that had swept through the valley the previous spring. Adam was left alone, the sole inhabitant of a house built for 4, a house that now seemed to hold its breath around him. For months, he was a phantom, a shape seen tending his small garden at dusk, or walking the perimeter of his land in the pre-dawn mist. He spoke to no one, and no one, respecting the deep chasm of his grief, dared to speak to him. That is, until the hammering began. It started on a Tuesday in late October. The sky was a vast, unforgiving sheet of gray, and a cold wind stripped the last remaining leaves from the skeletal branches of the oak trees. The sound carried. It was a methodical, rhythmic striking of iron against iron, then iron against wood. It was a sound of construction, or perhaps of deconstruction. A passing farmer, on his way to town with a wagon of winter squash, was the first to see it. He reined in his horse, his brow furrowed in confusion. Adam Veylor was on a ladder, his back to the road, holding a wide plank of raw, splintered pine against the upper story window of what had been his son's room. With a heavy framing hammer, he was driving long, thick nails through the board and deep into the window casing. The farmer watched for a full 5 minutes as Adam, with a grim and focused determination, secured the plank until not a sliver of glass was visible. Then he moved the ladder to the next window and began the process anew. The farmer, a man of simple certainties, could find no reason for such an act. There were no storms on the horizon, no reports of marauders or vagrants in the county. He urged his horse onward, the rhythmic sound of Adam's labor following him long after the Veylor house had disappeared from view. By the following day, the entire second floor of the house was a featureless wall of rough-hewn timber. The windows, which had once looked out over the rolling hills and the distant spire of the town church, were gone, replaced by a fortress-like barricade. This was no temporary measure. The nails were not tacked in place but driven deep, their heads sunk into the soft pine with a permanence that was deeply unsettling. The work was slow and arduous. Adam did not seem to sleep or eat. As the sun rose, he was there, hammer in hand. As it set, casting long, distorted shadows across the yard, he was still there, his silhouette a study in obsessive, relentless effort. The townsfolk, their curiosity now peaked to a level of genuine concern, began to speak of it in hushed tones at the general store and after the Sunday service. The narrative they constructed was one of grief. The poor man, they reasoned, had finally broken. He was sealing away the memories, erasing the rooms where his children had slept and dreamt, rooms that now held nothing but a suffocating absence. It was a tragic, pitiful act, but one that, in its own strange way, made a certain kind of sense to a community well acquainted with loss. It was the town doctor who made the first official inquiry. He was a man of science and logic, a pragmatist whose hands were calloused from years of setting bones and delivering babies. He had attended to Adam's children in their final agonizing days and felt a lingering, professional guilt, a sense that he had failed the family in their most desperate hour. He rode his horse out to the Veylor property on the 4th day of the sealing, tying the reins to the fence post and walking up the path that was now littered with wood shavings and bent nails. The entire front of the house was now boarded over. Adam was working on the back porch, preparing to seal the kitchen door. He did not look up as the doctor approached. His movements were mechanical, his face a mask of exhaustion. The skin was stretched tight over his cheekbones, and his eyes, when he finally turned them toward his visitor, were hollowed out, dark pools of something the doctor could not immediately diagnose. The doctor began with gentle pleasantries, commenting on the chill in the air and the likelihood of an early snow. Adam offered no reply. He simply selected another plank from the pile beside him, measuring it against the door frame with an unnerving precision. The doctor, clearing his throat, pressed forward, asking if Adam required any assistance, if perhaps he was preparing the house for a long journey. Adam paused, his hammer held loosely at his side. He turned his head slowly, his gaze seeming to pass through the doctor and fix on some distant point beyond the horizon. He informed the doctor, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, that he was not going anywhere. He was making the house safe. The doctor, perplexed, gestured to the impenetrable facade. He asked what threat could possibly warrant such measures. Was it fear of intruders? The local sheriff could be asked to patrol more frequently. Was it the winter winds? Surely, he was making more work for himself than necessary. A few nails in the shutters would suffice. Adam's eyes finally met the doctor's, and for a fleeting moment, the physician saw a flicker of raw, unadulterated terror. Adam told him that the threat was not something the sheriff could guard against. It was a matter of sounds, of voices. He said he was ensuring the house would be quiet. He needed to make it quiet. Before the doctor could formulate another question, a more clinical inquiry into the nature of these voices, Adam turned back to his work, lifting the heavy plank and setting it in place. The first nail was driven with a ferocity that made the doctor take an involuntary step back. The conversation, it was clear, was over. The doctor's report to the town council was delivered with a heavy heart. He spoke of Adam's physical deterioration, his profound psychological distress, and his strange, paranoid fixation. He used terms like melancholia and auditory hallucinations, suggesting that Adam's grief had curdled into a sickness of the mind. The council, a group of sober-minded merchants and landowners, listened with sympathy, but their conclusion was a pragmatic one. Adam Veylor was on his own land. He was a danger to no one but, perhaps, himself. As long as he remained on his property and did not disturb the peace, his eccentricities were his own affair. They agreed to have the sheriff check on him periodically, but they would not intervene. In the small, isolated communities of the 19th century, the boundary between private sorrow and public concern was a stark and rarely crossed line. And so the work continued. The back door was sealed, then the small window in the pantry, then the cellar grate on the north side of the house. Adam worked with the methodical pace of a man performing a sacred rite. He did not simply cover the openings, he obliterated them. He used overlapping layers of boards, weaving them together in a crosshatch pattern that left no gaps, no seams through which light or air or sound could penetrate. He even sealed the chimney flue, climbing onto the steep pitch of the roof with a bucket of mortar and a stack of bricks, meticulously cementing the opening shut until the house could no longer breathe. His neighbors watched from a distance, their initial pity slowly giving way to a creeping sense of dread. The Veylor house was no longer just a site of tragedy, it was becoming a monument to it. It stood on its small hill like a great, windowless skull, a blind and mute testament to a sorrow that was actively, aggressively, shutting out the world. A week after the doctor's visit, the minister's wife decided it was her Christian duty to make an appeal. She was a formidable woman, the undisputed matriarch of the town's social and spiritual life. She baked a loaf of bread, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and walked the mile to the Veylor farm, convinced that a woman's touch and a reminder of God's grace could succeed where masculine logic had failed. She found Adam in the front yard, coiling a length of rope. He had finished boarding the house itself and was now turning his attention to the periphery. He had already sealed the small door to the well house and was now looking at the barn. The minister's wife, putting on her most compassionate expression, called out to him. She spoke of the community's concern, of their prayers for his solace. She offered him the bread, a simple gesture of communion. Adam stopped his work and looked at her, his expression unreadable. He did not take the bread. He simply stood there, the rope held in his hands like a dead serpent. She pressed on, her voice soft but firm. She told him that while God's house has many mansions, a man's home is meant to be a place of light and fellowship, not a self-made prison. She spoke of the importance of letting the sun in, both literally and metaphorically. She suggested that by sealing himself away, he was shutting out the very comfort he so desperately needed. It was then that Adam spoke, and the words he used would be repeated in the town for years to come, becoming the foundation of the local legend. He told the minister's wife that he appreciated her concern and the bread, but he explained that she was mistaken. He was not shutting himself in, he was shutting something else out. She asked him what it was, what he was so afraid of. He looked at the house, at the blank, wooden facade that had once been filled with glass and curtains, and the faces of his family. He said he was trying to silence the voices. He told her they were in the rooms, in the walls. They whispered, he said, when the wind blew. They called out when the house was still. He confessed that he had to make it stop. The minister's wife, for the first time in her memory, was at a complete loss for words. The conviction in his voice was absolute. He was not speaking in metaphors. He was describing his reality. She placed the loaf of bread on the ground, a few feet from where he stood, and retreated, her sense of Christian duty overwhelmed by a profound and primal fear. The man was not grieving, he was haunted. The final act of sealing was the front door. It was the last portal, the one remaining link between the interior of the Veylor house and the outside world. For 2 days, it remained untouched, a dark rectangle of normalcy in a wall of raw, chaotic timber. It was as if Adam himself hesitated at this final, irrevocable step. But on the 3rd day, as a bruised-looking dusk settled over the valley, he began. He did not board it from the outside. Instead, he carried the lumber, the hammer, and a great quantity of nails inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. A neighbor, a man who lived on the adjacent farm, saw the lamplight flicker in the gap of the doorway. He watched as Adam moved back and forth in the gloom, a silhouette against the faint, warm light. Then, the door was pushed closed. The latch clicked into place, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the evening stillness. A moment later, the first nail was driven through from the inside. The sound was different now, muffled, hollow. It was the sound of a man nailing his own coffin shut. One by one, the nails were driven home, their sharp points piercing the thick oak of the door and emerging on the outside like metallic thorns. The hammering continued for nearly an hour, long after darkness had fallen completely. Then, it stopped. The light in the doorway was extinguished, and a new kind of silence descended upon the Veylor property. It was a complete, hermetic, and deeply unnatural silence. The house was now a sarcophagus, and Adam Veylor, by his own hand, was sealed within it. The core question that settled over the community was no longer one of sanity or grief. It was something far darker, far more elemental. Why would a father, the sole survivor of his line, barricade himself inside a house that was, for all intents and purposes, entirely empty? What voices could be so terrifying that a man would choose to entomb himself in darkness and silence just to escape their sound? The boarded-over windows provided no answers. They only stared out over the dying autumn fields like blind eyes, guarding a secret that was locked deep within the suffocating, silent heart of the home. The silence, however, was a fragile thing, and it would not hold for long. Inside the sealed Veylor house, a new world was born. It was a world without sun or moon, a universe of absolute blackness governed not by the passage of time but by the subtle shifts in the character of its silence. The air, trapped and motionless, grew thick and heavy, carrying the scent of aging pine, cold stone, and the faint, dusty perfume of a life that had been abruptly extinguished. For Adam Veylor, the first few days were a kind of victory. The cacophony of the outside world, the rustle of wind in the trees, the distant lowing of a neighbor's cattle, the rattle of a passing wagon, all of it was gone. He had achieved a level of quiet that was profound, almost geological. He moved through the familiar geography of his home by touch, his hands tracing the cold plaster of the walls, the smooth, worn wood of the furniture. He had created a sensory deprivation chamber, a void in which he hoped the phantom sounds that had plagued him would finally be starved into non-existence. But the house had its own memory, and in the perfect, suffocating stillness he had so painstakingly constructed, the faintest whispers began to bloom. At first, he dismissed them. He attributed the sounds to the house settling, the groan of old timbers under the strain of his fortifications. He told himself it was the blood rushing in his own ears, a physiological protest against the unnatural quiet. These were rational, scientific explanations, the kind of logic the town doctor would have approved of. He clung to these explanations as a drowning man clings to a piece of driftwood. He would sit for hours in the parlor, his body rigid, his breathing shallow, and attempt to catalog the natural acoustics of his sealed environment. He learned to distinguish the creak of a floorboard in the attic, expanding in the day's trapped heat from the sigh of the foundation contracting in the chill of the night. He became a connoisseur of the mundane, an expert in the language of a dying house. Yet, beneath this veneer of self-imposed logic, a deeper, more terrifying truth was beginning to surface. The sounds he was hearing were not random, they were not structural, they were articulate. The first voice he could not deny was the sound of his daughter. It was not a cry or a scream, but a simple, gentle hum. It was the sound she used to make when she was coloring at the kitchen table, a tuneless, contented melody that was as familiar to him as the sound of his own name. He was in the hallway when he heard it, a faint, ethereal thread of sound that seemed to emanate from the direction of her sealed bedroom. His heart seized in his chest. He stood frozen, every muscle tensed, listening. The humming continued for perhaps 10 seconds, a perfect, unwavering note of childish innocence, and then it faded, dissolving back into the oppressive silence. He did not move for a full hour. He simply stood in the darkness, his mind a battlefield of reason and terror. It was impossible. The room was empty. The house was empty. He was alone, yet he had heard it. The sound was not a memory, triggered by grief. It had possessed a physical quality, a presence in the air that was as real as the floorboards beneath his feet. That night marked the beginning of the true haunting. Sleep offered no escape, only a descent into a state of hypervigilance. He would lie on his bed, fully clothed, and listen to the house. The whispers started in earnest, always from the children's rooms. They were never loud, never clear enough to be fully understood. They were sibilant, like the rustling of dry leaves, fragments of words that teased the edge of his hearing. He would hear a soft giggle from his son's room, a sound he had not heard in over a year, a sound that now sent a spike of ice through his veins. He would hear the faint, rhythmic creak of the rocking horse that still stood in the corner of the nursery, a sound that implied the weight of a rider who was no longer there. His rational mind fought back, supplying explanations. It was the wind, somehow, finding a microscopic fissure in his defenses. It was a rat, scurrying in the walls, its tiny claws mimicking the sounds of a child's play. But he knew, deep in the core of his being, he knew he was not alone. Driven by a desperate need to confront the source, he began his nightly patrols. His only companion was an old kerosene lantern, its glass globe cleaned and its wick trimmed with a ritualistic precision. The simple act of striking a match, of bringing a small, controlled sun into the crushing darkness, was a comfort, but the comfort was short-lived. The lantern cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and recoil from the light. The familiar objects of his home were transformed into monstrous, distorted versions of themselves. A coat hanging on a peg became a hunched figure. A rocking chair, caught in the moving light, seemed to sway on its own. Armed with this flickering flame, he would walk the length of the house, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. He would stand outside his son's room, his ear pressed to the cold wood of the door, and listen. The whispers would stop the moment he approached, as if the source was aware of his presence, as if it was toying with him. He would gather his courage, turn the brass knob, and push the door open. The lantern light would slice into the darkness, illuminating a scene of perfect, undisturbed stillness. The bed was neatly made, covered with a thin layer of dust that sparkled like frost in the lamplight. The small wooden soldiers stood in their neat rows on the windowsill, their painted faces impassive. The air was cold and dead. There was nothing, no sign of entry, no source for the sounds. He would cross the room, his boots leaving tracks in the dust, and run his hand along the boarded-up window, feeling the rough texture of the pine and the cold heads of the nails. He had sealed this room himself. He knew its every inch. It was a sterile, lifeless container, and yet, moments before, it had been alive with the ghost of his son's laughter. The contradiction was a slow, creeping poison to his sanity. He would perform the same ritual at his daughter's room. He would hear the faint humming, the whisper of a name that sounded like his own, and he would burst in, the lantern held high like a weapon, and he would find the same crushing emptiness. The small doll, its porcelain face cracked and serene, lay on the pillow where his daughter had left it. The small book of nursery rhymes was on the nightstand, a silent testament to a voice that would never read from it again. Every room stood empty, every corner was accounted for, and still, the voices remained. The phenomenon began to evolve. The voices were no longer confined to the children's rooms. They started to migrate. One evening, as he sat in the kitchen, attempting to eat a piece of dry bread by the light of a single candle. He heard his wife. It was her voice, clear as day, coming from the parlor. She was humming a lullaby, the same one she had sung to both of their children every night of their lives. The sound was so real, so filled with the warmth and tenderness he remembered, that for a moment his grief overwhelmed his fear. He called out her name, his voice cracking with a desperate, pathetic hope. The humming stopped instantly. He was answered only by the echoing of his own voice in the empty house. He grabbed the lantern and stumbled into the parlor. The room was cold and silent. The needlepoint she had been working on was still in its basket by her chair, a silent, unfinished sentence. He stood in the center of the room, the lantern light casting his own trembling shadow on the walls, and he wept. It was a deep, guttural sound of a man who had lost everything, not once, but twice. This event marked a critical turning point in his psychological state. The question that had tormented him, the question of whether the voices were real or a product of his own fractured mind, began to seem irrelevant. The effect was the same. His home, the one place that should have been a sanctuary for his grief, had become his tormentor. The memories of his family, once a source of bittersweet comfort, had been weaponized against him. They were no longer his own. They had been absorbed by the house itself, and were now being played back to him in a cruel, unending loop. The house was breathing. It was speaking in the language of his dead. He began to feel like a specimen under glass, a solitary man being subjected to a relentless, inexplicable experiment. The claustrophobia of his physical environment was now matched by a profound psychological claustrophobia. There was no escape, not from the house, and not from his own head. The whispers grew more complex. They were no longer just sounds, but coherent phrases, always spoken in the voices of his children. He would hear his son, from the top of the stairs, ask if he could have a drink of water. He would hear his daughter, from behind the sealed pantry door, ask if he would read her a story. These were not memories, they were direct addresses. They were questions that demanded an answer, questions that hung in the dead air, pulsating with a horrifying sense of presence. He tried to ignore them. He would cover his ears, hum loudly to himself, anything to drown out the phantom solicitations. But the voices seemed to slip through his defenses, seeping directly into his consciousness. They were not sound waves traveling through the air. They were thoughts, implanted directly into his mind. The line between what was outside and what was inside began to blur completely. Was he hearing the echoes of his children, or was he finally hearing the complete and utter collapse of his own sanity? The core question became a relentless, unanswerable refrain in the silence of his thoughts. One night, the phenomenon shifted again, becoming more interactive, more malevolent. He was in his own bedroom, trying to find a moment's peace, when he heard a new sound. It was the soft, rhythmic patter of small feet running down the upstairs hallway. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times before, the sound of his children chasing each other before bedtime. But now, it was a sound of pure terror. The footfalls were light, quick, and unmistakably real. They grew louder as they approached his door, and then they stopped directly outside. He held his breath, his eyes wide in the darkness, staring at the door. He waited for a knock. He waited for a voice. But there was only silence, a heavy, expectant silence. He felt a presence on the other side of that door, a palpable weight in the atmosphere. He knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that if he were to open that door, he would see them standing there. He remained frozen for what felt like an eternity, his mind screaming, until the first rays of dawn, unable to penetrate his sealed windows, could be imagined far beyond the walls. The presence eventually receded, but the experience left him fundamentally changed. He was no longer just a victim of this haunting. He was a prisoner, taunted by invisible, inescapable jailers. It was this event, this direct and terrifying confrontation with an unseen but clearly intelligent force, that pushed him past the limits of passive suffering. Fear gave way to a new, colder emotion, a desperate, obsessive need to understand. If he could not silence the voices, then he would have to confront them. He would have to study them. He would have to treat his own home as a laboratory, and his own torment as a subject for clinical observation. The grief-stricken father, the terrified recluse, was beginning to recede, and in his place, a new persona was emerging. He would become an archivist of the dead, a cataloger of whispers. He found an old, leather-bound ledger, a relic from his brief and unsuccessful attempt at running a small grist mill, and a bottle of ink that had not yet dried out. He sharpened a quill, and by the flickering, unsteady light of a single candle, he sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet for the moment, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. He opened the ledger to the first blank page. He wrote the date, a gesture of order in a world that had none. And then he began to document. He would turn his subjective, terrifying experience into objective data. It was a madman's logic, the last resort of a mind trying to build a fortress of reason against an ocean of the inexplicable. The father as a passive listener was gone. The father as an archivist had just been born. The transformation of Adam Veylor from a man besieged by his senses to a man who weaponized them began in the dead of the house's third week of silence. Seated at the great oak table in the kitchen, a space that had once been the warm, beating heart of his home, he created a sanctuary of methodical observation. The world outside his sealed walls had ceased to exist. His reality was now circumscribed by the reach of his lantern's glow and the vast, ink-black territories that lay beyond it. The ledger, with its crisp, empty pages, became his new firmament, a place where the chaos of his experience could be pinned down, dissected, and forced to yield some form of logic. He was no longer merely a father consumed by grief. He had assumed a new, more profound role. He was an explorer charting an unseen landscape, a scholar translating a language meant only for the dead. His methodology was born of a desperate need for order. Each entry in the ledger was structured with a rigid, almost beautiful precision. He began by creating a system for measuring time. With no sun or moon to guide him, he relied on the slow, steady consumption of his candles. He had purchased a crate of them from the general store weeks before his self-imprisonment, and he now used them as his chronometers. By observing the rate at which a single tallow candle burned down, he could mark the passage of hours with a reasonable degree of accuracy. Each entry began with an estimation of the time, noted as first candle, third hour, or fourth candle, first hour. This was followed by a precise description of the auditory event. He forced himself to use a dispassionate, scientific vocabulary, stripping the phenomena of their emotional power in a futile attempt to neutralize them. A sound was not a terrifying whisper, it was a low-decibel sibilant vocalization. His daughter's ghostly humming was recorded as a sustained, unmodulated, pre-lyrical human tone. The first entry was made on a night he designated as the 22nd day of his isolation. The silence had been absolute for nearly a full candle's burn. Then, from the upstairs corridor, he heard it. The distinct, unmistakable sound of a child's marble being dropped on the wooden floor, followed by the faint, rattling sound of it rolling until it came to a stop against a wall. He held his quill poised above the page, his body perfectly still, listening. He noted the time. He noted the location, which his ears, now preternaturally sensitive, placed just outside his son's bedroom. He described the acoustic properties of the sound, the initial sharp report, the decaying resonance of the roll. He did not write that this was the sound of the glass marble he had given his son for his 7th birthday. He did not write that the sound filled him with a cold, suffocating dread. He simply recorded the data, his hand steady, the scratch of the quill, the only sound in the vast, listening darkness. The act of writing it down was an act of defiance. It was a declaration that what he was experiencing was not a hallucination but an observable, verifiable event. As the days, measured in inches of burnt tallow, bled into weeks, the ledger began to fill. It became a dense, obsessive chronicle of the house's secret life. Adam developed his investigation further, moving from simple cataloging to active analysis. He drew a crude but functional floor plan of the house on 2 facing pages of the ledger. On this map, he began to plot the origin point of every sound, using a complex system of symbols he had devised himself. A small circle indicated a whisper, a cross represented a footstep, a triangle denoted an articulate phrase. The map became a constellation of paranormal activity, a visual representation of the forces that occupied the space alongside him. He discovered that the overwhelming majority of the phenomena were concentrated on the 2nd floor, within the confines of the children's former bedrooms and the hallway that connected them. The ground floor, the parlor, the kitchen, his own bedroom, these areas remained largely silent, inert zones in a house that was otherwise crackling with unseen energy. This spatial mapping led to his first significant breakthrough. By cross-referencing his map with his chronological logs, he began to perceive patterns, faint but unmistakable rhythms in the haunting. He noticed that the sound of his daughter's humming was most frequently recorded in the hours he estimated to be the late afternoon. This was the time of day when she would sit in her room, the western sun pouring through the window, and draw pictures of the family. The whispers from his son's room, often containing fragmented questions about the stars or the weather, clustered in the hours after what would have been sunset, the time when he would be preparing for bed, his young mind still buzzing with the day's discoveries. The house, it seemed, was not just replaying random sounds. It was reenacting the domestic routines of his lost family. It was performing a ghostly pantomime of a life that no longer existed. The most profound and disturbing pattern he discovered was the liturgy. On the nights he identified as Sundays, the whispers would change in character. They would coalesce into the simple, rhyming prayers his wife had taught the children. He would hear his son's voice, a hesitant and mumbled recitation of, "Now I lay me down to sleep," followed by his daughter's clearer, more confident echo of the same words. The voices would rise and fall in the familiar cadence of rote memorization, a perfect, spectral echo of their nightly ritual. For Adam, this discovery was a moment of terrible, exquisite validation. It was proof. The sounds were not random echoes trapped in the wood and plaster. They were evidence of a persistent consciousness, a lingering, intelligent presence that was still bound to the rhythms of its former life. He was not being haunted by a place. He was in communion with his children. The thought was both a comfort and a torment. It suggested that they were not gone, but it also meant they were trapped here with him, in this cold, dark box, forever repeating the last, fading fragments of their lives. This belief, this certainty that he was an archivist of souls, fundamentally altered his purpose. He was no longer just a man trying to survive a haunting. He was a father, tending to the memory of his children in the only way he now could. He began to see his work as a sacred duty. He was preserving the last vestiges of their existence. His meticulous record-keeping was an act of love, a testament to the fact that they had been here, that they had lived and breathed and filled these rooms with their voices. The core question that had plagued him, whether he was preserving evidence or creating it, seemed to have been answered. He was a witness. He was a recorder of the dead. His clinical detachment was a necessary tool, a way to maintain the integrity of the record. He wrote in the ledger that he was like a naturalist, observing a delicate and previously unknown form of life, a species that existed not in the physical world, but in the resonant echoes of memory and place. He refined his techniques. He would spend hours in absolute stillness, his head cocked, his entire being focused on the act of listening. He learned the subtle vocabulary of the house, the way a whisper from the nursery had a different tonal quality than one from the hallway. He could distinguish the phantom footfalls of his son from those of his daughter, one heavier and more clumsy, the other lighter, more fleeting. He filled page after page with these observations, the ink-smudged columns of text, a testament to his singular, all-consuming focus. The flickering candlelight would catch the wet gleam of the ink as he wrote, his own shadow looming large and distorted on the wall behind him, the silent, hunched guardian of this terrible, sacred archive. The house had become his laboratory, his church, his prison, and his tomb, all at once. He believed he had found a kind of equilibrium, a way to coexist with the phenomenon that had nearly destroyed him. He had taken the chaos and imposed a system upon it. He had taken the terror and transformed it into data. He had, in his own mind, found a way to manage the impossible. He saw himself as a gatekeeper, the sole custodian of a profound and terrible secret. But the universe he was studying was not stable. The forces he was so carefully documenting were not static. They were capable of evolution, and one night, during what he calculated to be the early hours of a Tuesday in December, his carefully constructed system was shattered. He was cataloging a familiar event, the sound of his daughter's soft weeping from her bedroom, a sound that always manifested in the deepest part of the night. He noted the time, the location, the typical duration, and then a new sound intruded. It was a voice he had never heard before. It was not the high, ethereal whisper of his children, nor the gentle melodic hum of his wife. It was low, guttural, and filled with a resonant malevolence that was utterly alien to the domestic symphony of his haunting. It spoke a single word, a word that did not come from a memory of love or family prayer. The voice came from the cellar, a part of the house that had, until that moment, been completely silent on his map. And the word it spoke was his own name. It was not called out in love or in need. It was spoken with a cold, possessive certainty. It was the sound of a master calling his dog. Adam's quill froze over the page. The ink dripped from the nib, forming a dark, spreading stain on the meticulously kept record. The pattern was broken. The data was corrupted. His archive, which he had believed to be a complete and sacred text, was suddenly, terrifyingly incomplete. An unknown variable had been introduced into his experiment, and the ordered, predictable world of his obsession began to unravel into a new and far more profound level of darkness. The father, as archivist, had reached the limits of his knowledge. He was about to discover what it meant to be the subject of someone else's study. The intrusion of the new voice marked the beginning of a violent and terrifying paradigm shift within the sealed ecosystem of the Veylor house. The delicate, sorrowful equilibrium Adam had established was not merely disrupted, it was annihilated. The singular, guttural utterance of his name from the cellar was the opening salvo in a new phase of the haunting, one characterized not by the sad, looping echoes of the past, but by an aggressive, intelligent, and utterly hostile present. His meticulously crafted system of observation, his ledger and his map, which had once been a shield of logic against the encroaching madness, now seemed like a child's naive drawing in the face of a tidal wave. The phenomena no longer adhered to the patterns he had so carefully identified. The breaches in the silence became unpredictable, chaotic, and increasingly physical. The voice from the cellar did not speak again for 3 full candle cycles. During this period, the house fell into a deep and profound stillness, a silence that was qualitatively different from what had come before. It was not the empty, waiting silence of the early days, nor the pregnant, whispering silence of his archival phase. This was a heavy, predatory silence, the kind of absolute quiet that precedes a violent attack. Adam found himself unable to write. He would sit at the kitchen table, the ledger open before him, the quill in his hand, but his mind was paralyzed. He was no longer an observer, he was prey. He found himself straining to hear not the familiar whispers of his children, but the return of that other, alien presence. He abandoned his structured candle-based timekeeping and simply sat in the darkness, a sentinel waiting for an enemy he could not see or understand. When the assault resumed, it was not with a voice, but with a physical act of impossible violence. It was the middle of the night, a time when the house was typically at its most active, with the faint, ethereal sounds of his children. He was dozing in his chair, a state of near-constant exhaustion having become his new reality, when he was jolted awake by a sound that shook the very foundations of the house. It was a single, colossal bang that emanated from the 2nd floor. It was not the sound of something falling over. It was the sound of a massive, explosive impact against the outer wall of his son's bedroom. It sounded as if a battering ram had been swung with titanic force against the boarded-up window. Adam leaped to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs. The lantern on the table rattled, its flame guttering wildly. The sound was followed by a splintering, cracking noise, the sound of wood fibers being torn apart under immense pressure. He grabbed the lantern and, fueled by a mixture of terror and a father's primal, protective rage, he raced up the stairs. The whispers of his children were gone, replaced by the lingering, deafening echo of the impact. As he reached the top of the stairs, he could already feel a change in the air. A draft. A cold, damp wind was blowing through the upstairs hallway, a sensation he had not felt in months. It carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves, the smell of the world he had sealed away. He raised the lantern, its light cutting a trembling swath through the darkness. The door to his son's room was ajar. He pushed it open, and the wind hit him with greater force, causing the lantern flame to nearly extinguish. He lifted the light higher and saw the source of the impossible draft. The boards he had nailed over the window, the thick, overlapping planks of solid pine he had secured with dozens of long, heavy nails, were shattered. A huge, gaping hole had been punched through the very center of the barricade, splintered wood jutting inwards like the broken ribs of a ravaged carcass. Through the hole, he could see the churning, lightless gray of the night sky. He stumbled into the room, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. There was no storm outside. He had heard no thunder, no evidence of a gale force wind capable of such destruction. There was no tree branch close enough to have struck the house with that kind of force. It was an act of targeted, intelligent demolition. He ran his trembling hand over the splintered edges of the hole. The wood was cold and damp from the night air. He looked down at the floor and saw something that made the blood freeze in his veins. There were wet, muddy footprints on the dusty floorboards. They were not his, and they were not the small, faint outlines of a child's bare feet. They were large, misshapen, and seemed to lead from the shattered window to the center of the room, where they simply stopped. There were no corresponding prints leading back to the window. Whatever had made them was still in the house. From that moment on, the nature of the haunting transformed from a spectral echo into a physical occupation. The new presences were not content to whisper from the confines of specific rooms. They began to roam. He would hear heavy, dragging footsteps in the attic above his head, the sound of something large and cumbersome being pulled across the floorboards. The sealed doors of the house, which had been silent for months, began to rattle violently in their frames, their knobs turning back and forth with a frantic, metallic clatter. It was as if a whole host of unseen entities had been unleashed within the walls, a chaotic and malevolent force that was systematically dismantling the sanctity and order of his home. The voices of his children did not disappear entirely, but they were changed. They were no longer the sad, gentle echoes of memory. Now, they were filled with fear. He would hear his daughter's voice, not humming a lullaby, but crying out for him from the darkness, her voice thin and terrified. He would hear his son calling for his mother, his words choked with a panic that felt chillingly real. It was a new and exquisite form of psychological torture. The entities were not just using the memory of his children against him, they were now puppeteering those memories, transforming his most cherished sounds into instruments of pure terror. He was forced to listen to the spectral echoes of his children's suffering, their ghostly voices pleading for a help he could not provide. The ledger became a record of this new, chaotic reality. His neat clinical entries gave way to frantic, sprawling script. His handwriting, once so precise, became a jagged, almost illegible scrawl. He ceased trying to map the sounds. They were everywhere now, a constant, overlapping cacophony of terror. He wrote of the new voices, for the one from the cellar was now joined by others. There was a high, cackling sound he would hear from the parlor, a sound of mindless, cruel amusement. There was a low, continuous growling that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards, a primal, animalistic sound that vibrated through the soles of his feet. The house was no longer a repository of sad memories. It had become a pandemonium, a bedlam of hostile spirits. The physical manifestations escalated. Objects began to move on their own. He would enter the kitchen to find every cupboard and drawer thrown open, their contents spilled across the floor. In the parlor, his wife's rocking chair would be in constant, violent motion, slamming back and forth as if ridden by a furious, invisible occupant. One night, as he sat huddled in his bedroom, the one room that had so far remained a relative sanctuary, he watched in abject horror as the small, framed photograph of his wife and children on his nightstand began to vibrate. It shook with increasing intensity until it flew off the table and shattered against the far wall, the sound of the breaking glass as sharp and final as a gunshot. His neighbors, who had long ago resigned themselves to the strange silence of the Veylor property, began to notice the change. The silence was broken. On nights when Adam was known to be sealed inside, they would hear the sounds. A passing farmer, taking a shortcut along the ridge that overlooked the Veylor land, reported hearing what sounded like a dozen people shouting inside the house, their voices rising and falling in a furious, unintelligible argument. The minister's wife, who still prayed for Adam's soul, claimed to have seen lights moving inside the house, flashes of cold, blue-white light that appeared and vanished in the boarded-up windows of the second floor. The house, which had been a blind, mute object of pity, was now becoming a source of active, communal fear. It was no longer just the tomb of a grieving man. It was a source of a palpable, encroaching malevolence that seemed to be leaking out into the surrounding countryside. The most terrifying evidence of this came from the sheriff, a man not given to flights of fancy. Responding to the growing unease in the community, he rode out to the property one evening with the intention of calling out to Adam to make some attempt at contact. As he approached, he heard the sounds himself, a low, chaotic rumble coming from within the house. He dismounted and walked to the front of the property, stopping before the heavily barricaded front door. He called out Adam's name, his voice loud and authoritative. He was answered not by Adam, but by a thunderous, coordinated banging that erupted from every single window and door of the house simultaneously. It was as if dozens of fists were hammering from the inside, a frantic, furious, and perfectly synchronized assault on the house's sealed shell. The nails on the boards rattled in their holes, and the sheriff could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. He drew his pistol, his training taking over, but there was nothing to shoot at. The banging continued for a full minute, a deafening, terrifying tantrum, and then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The house fell silent. The sheriff stood there for a long time, the cold night air raising goosebumps on his skin. He did not call out again. He backed away slowly, mounted his horse, and rode back to town, his face pale and grim. He told the town council that something was terribly wrong at the Veylor place, and that Adam Veylor may no longer be the only one inside. The breaches in the silence were no longer just Adam's private torment. They were now a public threat. And inside the house, Adam Veylor, a man who had sought only to quiet the ghosts of his own past, was now trapped in a war against a force that sought to tear down the walls of his reality, one board, one nail, one scream at a time. His descent was accelerating, and the final stages of his collapse were about to begin. The carefully constructed dam of Adam Veylor's sanity did not break with a single, cataclysmic fracture. It crumbled, piece by agonizing piece, under the relentless, escalating assault of the forces occupying his home. The man who had been the clinical archivist, the stoic prisoner, was gone. In his place was a raw, terrified animal, cornered in its own den, lashing out at shadows. The transition from passive endurance to active, futile resistance was a terrifying spectacle, witnessed only by the malevolent, unseen entities that now held absolute dominion over the house. His world, once defined by a suffocating but predictable silence, had become a maelstrom of psychological and physical violence, and he was at its epicenter, his mind finally, irrevocably, fracturing under the strain. The collapse began with a conversation. For months, Adam had been the silent listener, the passive recipient of the house's auditory torments. He had absorbed the whispers, the cries, the guttural threats, and recorded them with a desperate, scholarly detachment. But the constant, fearful pleading from the spectral voices of his children finally wore through his last defenses. One night, while huddled in the relative safety of the kitchen, he heard his daughter's voice from the top of the stairs, a thin, ethereal cry, repeating a single word over and over again. Father, Father, Father. It was a sound designed for maximum torment, a perfect imitation of a terrified child seeking comfort. In that moment, something inside Adam snapped. The grief and the terror and the helplessness fused into a single, explosive emotion: rage. He leaped to his feet, knocking his chair over with a clatter that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence. He stormed into the main hallway, the lantern held aloft like a weapon, its light casting his own wild, gesticulating shadow up the staircase. He screamed into the darkness, his voice raw and ragged from disuse. He told them to leave her alone. He shouted that they had no right to use her voice, that she was his daughter, not their plaything. It was the first time he had spoken aloud in weeks, and the sound of his own voice, so full of anguish and fury, seemed to shock him as much as it did the house. For a moment, there was an absolute, stunned silence, and then a sound came from the top of the stairs that chilled him to the bone. It was a soft, feminine giggle. It was not the innocent sound of his daughter. It was the mocking, cruel laughter of an adult woman, filled with a triumphant, malicious amusement. It was the sound of a predator, acknowledging that its prey had finally taken the bait. His outburst had not intimidated the forces, it had entertained them. It had confirmed for them that he was not just a passive observer, but an engaged participant in their terrible game. From that moment on, the nature of his torment changed. He was no longer just a target, he was a conversational partner. He began shouting into the empty rooms constantly. He would stand in the parlor and argue with the cackling voice. He would stand at the bottom of the cellar stairs and curse the guttural presence that lived in the damp darkness below. He begged, he pleaded, he threatened. He would demand that they show themselves, that they face him like a man. His only replies were the cacophony of disembodied laughter, the rattling of doors, and the terrified cries of his phantom children, their distress intensifying in direct proportion to his own. He was a king in a kingdom of ghosts, issuing decrees that no one followed, his authority a pathetic joke to his unseen subjects. His conversations were a fevered, one-sided dialogue with madness itself, a desperate attempt to impose his own will on a reality that had slipped its leash. His sacred archive, the ledger, became a casualty of this new, chaotic phase. In a fit of pure, unadulterated rage, he decided that his meticulous documentation had been a fool's errand. He had not been cataloging the dead, he had been writing them into existence. His obsession, his focused attention, had been the very thing that gave them strength. He saw his ledger not as a scientific record, but as a book of spells, a grimoire that had invited these demons into his home. One night, in a frenzy of self-loathing, he tore the pages from its binding. He ripped the carefully drawn maps, the neat columns of dates and observations, the chronicle of his own descent, into shreds. He threw the fistfuls of paper into the cold, dead hearth of the fireplace, intending to burn them, to destroy the evidence of his folly. But he had sealed the chimney months ago. There was no escape for the smoke, just as there was no escape for him. He was left with a pile of torn paper, a monument to his own shattered reason. The destruction of the logs brought him no peace. The absence of the ritual, the lack of a system to process the horror, left him completely untethered. He found himself lost in a sea of pure, unstructured terror. The need to document, to create order, was too deeply ingrained. Within days, he began to rewrite the logs. He found scraps of paper, the backs of old receipts, the blank pages of his wife's abandoned books, and he started again. But this new archive was a different beast. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by a fevered, paranoid desperation. His handwriting became a wild, sloping scrawl, the words bleeding into one another. He no longer described the sounds with scientific precision. He wrote directly to the voices. His notes became a series of desperate questions, pleas, and accusations. Who are you? What do you want from me? Why are you torturing my children? The pages were filled with these unanswerable questions, interspersed with prayers, curses, and fragments of memory from his former life. It was the raw, unfiltered transcript of a mind coming apart. His physical state deteriorated rapidly. He stopped eating almost entirely, sustaining himself on stale bread and sips of water from the bucket he had filled before sealing the door. His face became a mask of famine and fear, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, burning with a feverish intensity. He wandered the house constantly, a gaunt, skeletal figure drifting through the oppressive darkness, the lantern his only companion. His movements became ritualistic and strange. The neighbors, who had grown increasingly fearful of the sounds emanating from the Veylor property, began to catch glimpses of him. The hole that had been punched through the boards of the upstairs window became a terrifying new lens into his private hell. One neighbor, a farmer returning late from town, saw a light in that jagged opening. He stopped his wagon, his blood running cold. He could see Adam, illuminated from behind by the lantern, standing at the broken window. Adam was holding his hammer. He was trying to reboard the hole, but he had no new planks. He was simply hammering the broken, splintered pieces of wood back into place, the nails finding no purchase, the pieces falling away as soon as he let them go. He seemed oblivious to the futility of his task, his movements jerky and obsessive, the sound of the useless, repetitive, hammering a pathetic, lonely rhythm in the dead of night. It was the image of a man trying to rebuild a fortress that had already been overrun from the inside. He was a father undone, still trying to protect a home that was no longer a home, but a cage. His final descent was witnessed by the sheriff, who, against his better judgment, had returned to the property, compelled by a grim sense of duty. He did not approach the house this time, but watched from the cover of a small copse of trees at the edge of the property. He saw Adam emerge from the back of the house. This, in itself, was a shock. The sheriff had been there the day Adam had finished sealing every door. He knew for a fact that there was no way out, yet Adam was outside. He had somehow, in his madness, pried open one of his own barricades, only to reseal it from the outside once he was through. He was wandering the perimeter of the house, the lantern in one hand, the hammer in the other. He was talking to himself, his voice a low, urgent murmur that the sheriff could not quite decipher. He would stop at each boarded window and press his ear against the wood, as if listening for something inside. Then he would shout at the boards, his voice a mixture of pleading and anger. At one point, he began to drive new nails into the already sealed front door, layering them on top of the old ones, as if he believed a few more pieces of iron could hold back the tide that had already drowned him. The sheriff watched this sad, terrifying display for nearly an hour as the fog rolled in, shrouding the house and the wandering, ghost-like figure of its owner in a thick, gray blanket. The lantern glow became a diffuse, hazy sphere in the mist, and the sound of Adam's voice and his hammer became muffled and distant. The sheriff felt a profound sense of helplessness. Adam Veylor was beyond any earthly aid. He was a man locked in a battle with his own demons, demons that had taken on a terrifying physical form. The question that had always lingered in the minds of the townsfolk, the question of whether Adam's family had ever truly left, or if they had been swallowed by the house, now seemed to have a terrifyingly literal answer. It was as if the house itself, a malevolent entity, had consumed his wife and children, and was now, in the final act, consuming him as well. The sheriff turned and rode away, the image of Adam wandering in the fog, hammering nails into a house that was already a tomb, burned into his memory. He knew he was witnessing the final moments of a man's life. The next time anyone saw the inside of the Veylor house, Adam would be gone. He was about to vanish, absorbed completely into the silence and the darkness he had so foolishly invited in. The final, definitive silence descended upon the Veylor property, not with a sudden cessation of noise, but with the slow, creeping realization of an absence. After the sheriff's last grim observation of Adam's nocturnal ritual, the sounds from the house ceased. The chaotic banging, the furious, unintelligible arguments, the pathetic, lonely hammering, all of it stopped. For 2 full weeks, the house resumed its posture of a blind, mute tombstone on the hill. But this was not the tense, waiting silence of the beginning. It was the hollow, empty silence of a concluded act. The townsfolk, who had grown accustomed to the nightly disturbances, found the sudden quiet even more unsettling than the noise had been. It was the silence of a battlefield after the slaughter, a silence that spoke not of peace, but of a final, terrible resolution. It was a full 3 weeks after Adam was last seen that the town council, spurred by the sheriff's dire report and the growing unease of the community, finally decided to act. An official party was assembled, a grim-faced delegation consisting of the sheriff, the doctor, the minister, and 2 stout farmers who had been neighbors to the Veylor family. They arrived at the property on a cold, bright morning in early January, the ground frozen solid, the air so clear and sharp it hurt to breathe. The house stood before them, stark and forbidding against the pale winter sky. The haphazardly nailed boards, the shattered window on the second floor, the layers of nails driven into the front door, all of it spoke of the profound and violent madness that had unfolded within. There was no sign of life, no smoke from the sealed chimney, no light in the broken window. Their first task was to breach the fortress. They started with the front door, the most direct, and symbolically, the most significant point of entry. It took the 2 farmers the better part of an hour, working with pry bars and a heavy sledgehammer, to undo what Adam had so obsessively done. The wood of the door and its frame was a mangled ruin of splintered oak and bent iron. With a final, groaning crack, the door gave way, swinging inward into a gulf of absolute, frigid darkness. A wave of stale, cold air, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else, an acrid metallic odor that none of them could immediately place, washed over the men. They stood at the threshold, peering into the blackness, a collective sense of profound dread holding them in place. The sheriff, lantern in hand, was the first to step inside. The others followed, their boots crunching on a floor littered with debris. The lantern's glow pushed back the darkness, revealing a scene of utter chaos. The hallway was filled with shredded paper, the remnants of Adam's first destroyed ledger. Furniture was overturned, its upholstery torn as if by claws. The air was unnaturally cold, far colder than the winter air outside, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. They moved cautiously, a small island of light in a vast, dark ocean. They called out Adam's name, their voices sounding small and thin in the oppressive stillness. They were answered only by the echoing of their own calls, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the house's profound and unnerving silence. They conducted a systematic, room-by-room search. Each space they entered told the same story of neglect and violent derangement. The kitchen was a disaster of spilled flour and overturned containers. The parlor was a wreck, its furniture in disarray, the shattered remains of the family photograph crunching under the doctor's boots. As they ascended the stairs, the air grew even colder. They entered the son's room first, the scene of the violent breach. The hole in the window had been crudely patched with a few splintered boards, a testament to Adam's last, futile act of defense. The strange, muddy footprints were still there on the floor, preserved in the undisturbed layer of dust, a silent, inexplicable piece of evidence. The daughter's room was the same, a cold, still diorama of a life long since ended. Of Adam Veylor, there was no sign. He was not in the beds, not in the closets, not in the attic. It was in the kitchen, on the great oak table, where Adam had conducted his lonely, mad research, that they found his final legacy. His second archive, the collection of frantic notes and desperate questions scrawled on scraps of paper, was scattered across the tabletop. The minister, a man of letters, picked up a few of the scraps, holding them close to the sheriff's lantern. The handwriting was nearly illegible, a chaotic spiderweb of ink. The words were a testament to a mind that had completely unmoored itself from reality. He read a few of the fragments aloud, his voice low and trembling. One page contained a single, repeated question: "What do you feed on?" Another seemed to be a list of names, none of which were familiar to anyone in the town. A third, and most disturbing, was a rambling, incoherent entry that seemed to describe a final confrontation. It spoke of a cold shape that had risen from the stones below. It mentioned his children's voices, no longer crying in fear, but singing a new and terrible song. The final, legible line on the page was a single, chilling sentence. "It is the house that is hungry. They searched the cellar last." The door at the top of the stairs was, strangely, untouched, bolted from the outside. After wrestling with the rusted iron bolt, they opened it to reveal a set of steep stone steps, descending into a blackness that seemed even more absolute than that of the rest of the house. A damp, earthy smell, the source of the strange, acrid odor, wafted up to meet them. The sheriff descended first, his lantern held low. The cellar was small and earthen-floored. It contained nothing but a few rotting barrels and some discarded farm equipment. There was no sign of Adam. There was no sign of a struggle. There was nothing to explain the guttural voice he had heard, or the cold shape he had described in his final, mad entry. The man had simply, completely vanished. He had been erased. The official conclusion, recorded by the town doctor, was that Adam Veylor, in a state of profound psychological distress stemming from his grief, had abandoned the property and wandered off into the wilderness, presumably to perish from exposure. It was a neat, rational explanation that satisfied the town's need for closure. It allowed them to nail the door of the Veylor house shut for the final time and walk away, leaving the tragedy to be slowly reclaimed by the weeds and the weather. But for those who had been inside, for the men who had felt the unnatural cold and read the mad scribblings of a man chronicling his own consumption, this explanation was a thin and unsatisfying blanket thrown over a deep and terrifying mystery. The house remained empty, a rotting monument to a family that had been annihilated. But it did not remain silent. For years afterwards, travelers who passed the property at night would report hearing sounds drifting from the derelict structure. Some claimed to hear the faint, sad cries of children. Others spoke of a low, rumbling sound, like a furious, unintelligible argument taking place in the sealed rooms. The story of Adam Veylor became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children on dark winter nights, a story of a father who couldn't silence the voices in his house, even after he was gone. The core question, the one that lingered long after the last of the eyewitnesses had gone to their graves, was never truly answered. Was Adam Veylor a man driven mad by grief, who created a phantom world to populate his unbearable loneliness? Or was he a sane man who stumbled upon a terrible truth that some places, like some people, are born hungry, and that he and his family had been nothing more than sustenance for a house that had learned how to feed? The empty rooms remain, holding their secrets in a silence that is, to this day, not entirely silent. The case file on Adam Veylor is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.